Hello, my name is Dan Stewart, and I'm international editor of Time. I'm joined today by Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1997 and 2007. Today, he heads up the Institute for Global Change, a non-profit devoted to defending and expanding the centre ground in politics and advising policymakers on issues such as technology and healthcare. Throughout the pandemic, the Institute has been advising governments across the globe on how to handle the health, economic, and social challenges of the novel coronavirus. Mr. Blair, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start, if we can, by dealing briefly with the protests that started in the US and have slowly expanded to places in around the rest of the globe, the UK, Canada, France. I don't expect you to comment specifically on domestic policy or race relations in the US, but I wanted to ask you whether you think this, on top of the response to the pandemic, will change how America is seen globally, the things that we've seen in the past week.
I think, the killing and the murder of George Floyd has shocked people the world over and mobilized them. The sense that there is an injustice that has been languishing for a long period of time, whose roots go deep and which needs to be addressed. I think that is something. People aren't just looking at the US, by the way, they're looking at their own societies and thinking similar things. And so I think it's one of these tragic but seminal events in that sense. I also think it underlines something about COVID-19 and the crisis, which is my feeling is that all the things that were issues before this crisis are now issues that are more intense, more vivid, and where people's feelings about them are stronger and more demanding of action. So it's not as if the issues to do with racism, either in the United States or other countries, weren't issues prior to the COVID crisis. They were, but like a lot of other things, they're now before us in a way that I think is stimulating people to demand change in a deeper and faster way than before.
How do you think a democratically elected leader ought to be acting in this kind of situation when their country is beset by protests? And again, this is not just a question about the US. This is something I think, especially over the course of the pandemic, we're going to perhaps see more of. How should a leader speak to their people at a time of crisis?
Well, in tone and spirit, trying to bring people together, acknowledging the injustice, giving people a sense that they've got a common purpose in addressing it. But the single most important thing you always learn in politics is to have solutions. So it's not enough simply to say, well, this is a terrible event and we are all shocked by it and something must be done. The most important thing is to engage with it in a policy sense and to do something about it. And that requires you to address difficult and long-standing issues of deprivation, inequality, prejudice, and to come up with things that really work. Because otherwise, what happens is that you find there's these issues create division without a solution, and you need solutions in the end. And these questions can be addressed. I mean, there are solutions out there, but you've got to think about it carefully and then prepare plans of action.
Do you think, your first question, you said that the important thing is to bring people together. Do you see that happening in the US right now? Do you feel as if President Trump is doing that?
Well, the US is very divided right now. I mean, I don't want to comment on the United States president. I will say to people, I've got enough trouble in my own politics without getting into someone else's. But the United States is divided. Politics is very divided worldwide today. And I mean, one of the big challenges is whether you can find common ground to bring people together. I believe you can, and my institute's dedicated to trying to do that. But there's particularly in an era of social media, there is an advantage, I think, that many politicians see in stoking division rather than trying to calm it.
And how do we counter that? How do leaders counter that? How do policymakers or institutions? How do we counter that kind of messaging? Because it does feel like this is a moment where populist nationalists have drawn power from these kinds of divisions, and how do we counter that?
Yeah, you counter it by being much more muscular in the defence of reason and of policies based on evidence. And in respect of COVID, by the way, you can see those countries that have handled it best are those with governments that focus on effective policy. And one of the things my institute tries to do, for example, in the technology sphere, what we're trying to say is, look, we're living through now, and COVID will accelerate this, by the way, we're living through the 21st century equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. And we produced a paper not so long ago, which was interesting, in describing how in the 19th century Industrial Revolution, it took decades for politics to catch up with reality. So the world was being changed, but politicians were still debating, Whigs and Tories and things that really didn't touch on what was this massive industrial revolution going on, changing everything about the way the world of work operated, the nature of the economy. It took decades for politics to catch up. And I think in the 21st century, with this technological revolution, it should change and will change everything and offers huge opportunities, but also massive challenges of dislocation and displacement. And if you want solutions, you've got to start with analysis of how the world's changing. And my worry at the moment is that a lot of people on the left just want to default to traditional big state and tax and spending, and people on the right want to go to economic nationalism, protectionism, and particularly, of course, anti-immigration. And the truth is, neither of those two political positions offer a way forward for a future that is going to be determined by this technological change. And how you harness it for the benefit of the broad mass of people is the challenge.
And you say the pandemic is going to speed that up. How so? Can you describe that a bit?
I think you can see this already first of all, in a very specific way, you and I discussing now, by this, people having meetings using technology. There's been an acceleration of the use of technology in the British healthcare system, probably a greater acceleration of use of technology in the last 10 weeks than there was in the last 10 years. How you manage to through COVID, to come out the other side will also depend on technology. It's going to depend on bioscience. It's going to depend on track and trace. But then you look at how technology could transform education, law and order, transport. It's vast change. And COVID, I think, the economic fallout itself is going to spur a lot of change. And companies are going to be looking at how they reposition, how they retrain. New companies will come up. Some other companies will disappear. The implications of COVID are quite profound. I think this is going to be seen in retrospect as a point of inflection.
But the speed at which this is happening risks leaving certain classes of people behind, right? I mean, to take just one of the examples you gave, education, which is, we've moved to online learning very, very quickly, both in the US and in other developed nations. But people who don't have broadband access or may not have a laptop in their house are suddenly left out of education. And how do we ensure, as a society, to use one example, how do we ensure that we're looking at where those gaps are and ensuring that people are not being left behind?
Yeah, so absolutely right. So that's a classic example. So you've got to fix it. You've got to make sure that there is universal access to broadband. You've got to make sure that poorer communities are given the chance to connect with the world. You've got to reform your education system. We did a lot of reforms in the UK, and for example, in London, actually transformed school standards in London. But today you've got to go through a further transformation and using technology to teach better. In time, you should be able to use technology to teach each child almost individually, because children move at a different pace in different subjects. You've got to teach young people how to think creatively. It's not about, when I was at school, you're much younger than me, but when I was in school, and maybe even when you were at school, still learning about all the kings and queens of England and so on, and a whole lot of dates and history and things you had to memorize. Well, you've got all that at your fingertips today. But how you use that knowledge in a creative and innovative way, that's the challenge of education today. How do we make sure that people get access to high quality skills and training, so it's not seen as the poor cousin of university education? These are challenges, but there are answers to them. The thing is, what's happened with politics in the West is at the very moment when the solutions are not really ideological but practical, we've got ideology back in our politics in a big way, left and right. And it's a fascinating, but unfortunately very unproductive thing.
It strikes me that if we're going to move forward as a society, if we're going to come out of this pandemic ahead of it, if you like, then we're going to need to do so together, right? One thing that struck me about this novel coronavirus, if you like, is that it seems like each country has taken its own path to combat it. There has been, I mean, do you think that global cooperation has taken a backseat to national self-interest during this time?
I think global cooperation has taken a backseat, but I think to the undermining of national self-interest. I mean, I always say to people, the reason you should cooperate together is not because you want to help someone else, but because it's, I mean, that would be good, by the way, but primarily because you want to help yourself. So if you imagine how much better we would be in this pandemic if countries were working together on, for example, developing on-the-spot testing that you could use very simply, which I've no doubt at all. I mean, some of it will come in time, but it could come far faster if countries were combining together. The sharing of data, how you make sure that whatever vaccine succeeds, it's made globally available. How you ensure that there are economic measures taken by the world that are done on a coordinated basis. This is not to choose global cooperation over national self-interest. It is an enlightened view of national self-interest. And that's the absence of this coordination. It's just been, I literally don't understand it. I can't imagine, having been in those 10 years I was in office, for all the challenges, I just can't imagine being in a situation where if something like this had happened, there wouldn't have been a coming together of global leadership and saying, okay, whatever differences we have, let's see how we sort this out together.
You've called, you're one of a number of world leaders who called for an emergency G20 meeting. Why do you think that collection of leaders is appropriate to deal with this?
The trouble with the global architecture of governance is that it's very hard to locate the right place now. I mean, the truth of the matter is the UN Security Council it was constructed in a completely different era and is pretty gridlocked, to be blunt about it. So I think the G20 is probably the right mechanism because it pulls together the most powerful countries of the world. And then that should, if it's operating properly, act as a kind of hub and spoke. So you branch out to make sure you're touching all the different regions of the world, and so that countries don't feel completely excluded from the process. So I think the G20 probably is the right forum, but then it depends on global leadership there. And it's tough in circumstances where in particular, the two big powers in the world today, America and China, are obviously moving towards a much more confrontational position with each other.
Are you optimistic that they'll be able to overcome that? I mean, this call to bring the G20 together, are you optimistic that that'll happen?
I think it's 50-50 whether it happens, really. I think the case for it is overwhelming, but I do think it relies on the key players to be prepared to come together and put aside whatever differences they have, because you're not going to resolve these differences, and they're real. But to say, look, in respect to the following issues, we've manifestly got a common interest.
I guess the other forum that President Trump might prefer is a sort of modified version of the G7, right? To bring those leaders together with India, South Korea, Australia. I mean, I suppose to some extent, any collection of people working together that make up a certain percentage of the world's economies would be good. But do you see the shortcomings in that? Do you feel like that would leave voices out who should be in it?
Well, I think it's better than nothing, for sure. And so I would support that. I mean, it's difficult if you're not going to bring China, which is obviously such a powerful player in this, into the fold. And, I remember when I chaired the G7 or G8, as it was, summit back in 2005, and we put Africa and support for Africa and climate change on the agenda. we were able to expand past the G8 to include leading countries from different parts of the world, including China. And obviously that gives you a far better opportunity to bring people together and to achieve consensus. But I think the G7's certainly better than nothing. And G7 is still a powerful group of countries to convene. But I'm just not sure how you're going to do that. And you're going to have to involve more than those G7 members. And then once you decide who you're going to involve, there's no way you're going to come to global resolutions of issues without China's presence.
Mm-hmm. And of course, these forums are primarily economic. And a big part of this is also collaborating on a health solution, right, on treatment, and especially on vaccines, which I know that your Global Institute recently produced a study looking at the various kind of overlapping attempts to produce a vaccine without any kind of global collaboration. I mean, do you see that as being a risk for the world, that we don't really have the architecture yet to bring together those efforts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be fair to those working on vaccines, they actually are trying to cooperate with each other to a degree. And for example, the one that's predominant here in the UK at the moment, which is the Oxford Jenner Institute vaccine, I know there are very detailed and committed attempts to try and make sure that enough of that vaccine is manufactured for the world. But yeah, no, of course, if countries collaborate together, they'll get there faster. And the one thing you realize about medical science today is it all starts with data and the sharing of data. If you're able to have a much greater sharing of data, you're going to accelerate the potential to develop vaccines and other treatments. Because, you know, as I will say to people about the COVID-19 crisis, the problem, which is both extremely challenging and also very frustrating, is that COVID-19 is a disease that's much more serious than the common flu. That's true. On the other hand, still the vast majority of people will recover from it. And at any one time, only a small proportion of people will have it. And so the frustration is you have to lock down with all the economic, social, and indeed health consequences of the lockdown for everybody in order to try and get a handle on those that are infected and stop the spread. And the problem with that is that so lockdown is an incredibly blunt instrument. And, you know, I say to people, it may well be that the world looks back in 3 or 4 years' time and says, well, you know, this was a vast overreaction. But living through it at the moment doesn't feel like that. It feels like necessary in order to try and control the disease. But if you could get a vaccine or a therapeutic drug that reduced the severity of the disease, of course you could accelerate the release from lockdown. And the only other, so those are two game changers, and the half a game changer, in my view, is rapid at point of use, on the spot testing. Because I think if you're able to do that at scale, that also gives you the confidence and the ability to segregate that part that is at risk and let everyone else get back to something like normal.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I mean, we do have, to go back to your point about sharing data, we do have a UN agency that is, its job is to share healthcare data from countries all around the World Health Organization. Do you feel that that is the appropriate body to be doing some of this work? I know the US and the UK have both announced reservations about it collecting vaccine data, for example, and of course you've seen the US now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know the people at the World Health Organization, and I can tell you, they're working flat out and doing their very best, but we've got to be realistic about this. The World Health Organization was not set up and is not structured and organized to deal with something as massive as this. I mean, I dealt with the World Health Organization through the Ebola crisis because my institute works in those countries in West Africa where the crisis was, and my teams were very active in controlling it. But, you know, that was a lethal disease, but not actually very infectious in the end, fortunately, and located in one part of West Africa. I mean, this is a global pandemic, so there's no point in criticizing the WHO in these circumstances. We're going to support them through this, but recognize in the future you're going to have to revisit its architecture and organization, because the fact is, in the future, if we have something like this, you've got to have the global pandemic preparedness that we haven't had for this.
One of the things, talking about the future, I saw that the World Economic Forum has talked about a great reset for capitalism, and I think this goes back to the point that you were saying about sort of using this moment to think about how we proceed from this. Do you feel like, if you like, capitalism is the problem here, or what would that great reset look like to you?
Yeah, what would it look like is the issue. I mean, I always, whenever people tell me they want to reset capitalism, I mean, I think there are lots of issues around corporate governance, how companies operate, and all of these are important questions. And if you just look at, for example, the anxieties over the big tech companies, I would say during the course of this crisis, they got stronger, not weaker. They're going to emerge from this in a stronger position than they were before. Often what the innovators and the change makers want to do is just steer away from government. But this is difficult in circumstances where their innovations are changing society and changing the world of work. So I certainly think that issues around fairness and inequality, all of those things are right. But if you're talking about getting rid of the market, I don't think you will, and you shouldn't. And if you're talking about deep and fundamental change, I think the deep and fundamental change will be about managing this technology revolution and educating people.
Are you hopeful that there will be a course correction away from the sort of confrontation we're seeing between the US and China at the moment?
No, I think you're going to enter into a new era of much more tense relations, for sure. I don't think there's any way of avoiding that. And I think two things are clear as well. I think in the United States of America, this is pretty much a bipartisan issue. There aren't many, but that's probably one of them. And secondly, my sense, and you can see this from the way the British government has been moving in recent times, I think, and for these purposes, treating Britain as part of Europe, I think Europe will move more in the US direction. Not absolutely in the US direction, but more in the US direction.
We're almost out of time here. I did want to briefly ask you about Britain, the country that we're within. Have you been? Can you describe your reaction to how the government has been responding to this? I mean, the UK has one of the highest fatality rates in the world. What do you think is responsible for that?
Look, I always say about this crisis that I try to offer constructive advice and not criticism, because it really is an incredible challenge for governments. And the one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that whatever government was in power, people would come along years later and say, well, you should have done something different. But, hindsight's a great thing. So I have, genuine sympathy for the people taking the decisions. But I think in the UK case, I think most people, even in the UK government, would accept they were slow to get on top of it. And I think now the big question is around whether we have the right strategy to get out of it. And there, I think that there are significant questions, of which, in my view, the single biggest is, should we, because of the way Britain has suffered from this disease, which is worse than many other comparable countries, should we maintain the present government policy, which is very much for targeted testing and combining that with a track and trace system? Or do you need, for our situation to be managed correctly, to move to mass testing, where you're using rapid testing of both antigen and antibody testing at scale? And my strong feeling is that we do have to move to that. But that is the biggest question strategically at the moment the government's got to address. And I think there's a sense probably in government that they're having to reorganize things to do it better. But what we need to be mindful of is that it's one thing to get through these summer months, and as a result of what has been a very stringent lockdown with enormous economic consequences, let's assume you knock the disease, or you limit the disease radically during these summer months. You've got to prepare yourself for the possibility of a resurgence in the autumn and winter. And that's when you've got to have the capabilities in place to deal with it.
All right. Well, that's all we have time for today, I think. Just remains for me to say thank you very much for speaking to us today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Dan.